All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Phil Salvador. I am the library director at the Video Game History Foundation. We're a nonprofit that's out here in the Bay Area in California that is helping to, we like to say we're trying to make the future of video game history better. So we're building a library, as you can see. We've got Laura Croft behind me. But we're also doing a lot of advocacy around video game preservation work. And that brings us to the study we're talking about today. Back in July, we published a study that showed that 87% of classic video games are out of print. We liken it to, imagine if 87% of films you could only watch on VHS. That's kind of the state where video games are right now. If you're a researcher, there's effectively no legal pathway to access most of these games apart from, visiting a library in person or fending for yourself on eBay. So there's a real danger that these games will effectively not be accessible to researchers within our lifetime. So when we say that 87% of games are out of print, what we're saying is that they are endangered. And I want to kind of talk about what this market looks like that we were analyzing and why it's so bad for games in particular, and then get the conversation moving on what libraries can do differently, which Kendra and James will talk about in just a minute. But to explain, when we say we're analyzing the classic video game market, what we mean is older video games, from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, those games do get re-released. There are ways to play them without having to dig out an old console and play it anymore. On a lot of modern systems, you can download classic games. You have things like on the Nintendo Switch. There's a service called Nintendo Switch Online that provides access to classic video games, to the back catalog of, Mario titles and things like that. It's part of our cultural history. It's great that we can access these things through, standalone products like the PlayStation Classic, or just buying games a la carte through digital stores. But the reason we've been focusing on this for our study is that, you can get access to some classic games, but not all classic games. And it tends to be focusing on games that are profitable, games that there is a market for. If you look at things like Nintendo Switch Online or the PlayStation Classic, it tends to be well-known, marketable intellectual properties. It tends to be, like the Disney of games, essentially, are kind of the ones that you tend to be able to get. It's a much smaller subset of games as a whole, as an area. So what we've been asking is this enough for research and preservation needs? We're pretty comfortable saying no on that. And I know this might be a little weird for people who are used to working in other mediums like print or music or movies, that there's this, a whole chunk of the medium isn't available. So to kind of go over why that is, a couple examples here about why games don't end up on these services again. A lot of times there are technical issues. I point to this example here of The Sims 1, a game that is close to my heart. The original Sims, if you get out your CD of that and try running it in a modern computer, it just doesn't work. So if they wanted to re-release that game, I assume they would have to go back to the original source code and update it to run on a modern computer, or figure out some way to emulate Windows. It gets very complicated, and it might not make financial sense to do that. There's also a lot of rights and licensing issues around games that are messy and sticky. I had this example here of the No One Lives Forever video game series, which was a popular, influential spy game series. No One Lives Forever, when they made that game, they were not, like, 3 companies were co-signed to publish it, and the rights are divided among each other, and nobody can actually figure out who owns the rights to the game. So that they've tried to re-release that game, and they can't, because the rights issue is such a mess. There's a lot of cases like this in video games. Oftentimes there's some licensed content, like they lose the rights to the IP, or there's music that's used that they can't get the license to again, and it gets complicated and prohibitively expensive. We talked with folks at Stanford who estimated that in one of their game collections, maybe upwards of half the games in the collection were effectively orphaned works for these reasons. There's also, just in some cases, publisher disinterest in re-releasing games. I point to this example here, this kind of obscure Pokemon game called Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. It's kind of a cult hit, but it's one that Nintendo has simply chosen not to re-release, which is their right as a company. They're allowed to do that. But it means that if you legally want to get access to this game, you've got to go on eBay and look for it. And that right now, I think the minimum price is about $150 for a copy of that game. So it's pretty broadly inaccessible. But all these things kind of come down to one root problem, which is that classic video games were never made to last. As much as the game industry likes to talk about how video games are art and should be cherished and preserved, games, especially in the past, were treated more like products or like toys. They were something to be discarded, or the next product cycle they'd be moved on from. People weren't thinking about how you were going to sell these games in 20, 30 years. There wasn't a notion of this reissue market that we've been talking about. So you end up in a situation where effectively most classic video games you can't get from the rights holders anymore. It doesn't really meet the needs of what we need for, like, if you're trying to study video games. The commercial market just isn't cutting it. So we keep coming back to this question of, like, is this commercial market enough? The video game industry says, hey, look at this. We're re-releasing all these classic games. You can get all the Mario games. This is great. And then we have these anecdotes of, hey, Pokemon XD is unavailable. And we've been kind of arguing these anecdotes at each other for years. So we did this study because we figured, you know what? Let's prove this. Let's see if the commercial market is actually meeting the needs of researchers. Let's get out of the realm of anecdote and let's start arguing hard numbers. Let's actually see what percentage of video games are still in release. And as we said, the numbers are pretty bad. Just a little over 13% of classic games, which we defined it as all games that came out before 2010. We took a sample of games from a database and sort of had an army of volunteers analyzing whether you can get them through various platforms, and most of them you can't. And it was bad across all time periods. It was bad across all platforms. Again, that 13% that's in release, those tend to be the most popular games. That tends to be like, Final Fantasy and Sonic the Hedgehog and the games that people, want to spend money on. But to put it in context with other mediums, that's a little bit below the survival rate of silent films in the United States. We're talking about video games from 30, 40 years ago. They should not be anywhere close to being in that state. But we actually have some signs that it might be getting worse over time, too. A couple things we noticed in the study. First off, availability was worse for older games, particularly games that came out before 1985, which is sort of the pre-Mario Brothers era of video games. Availability drops below 3%. These are games that are kind of the foundational games for video games as a medium. They were still figuring out the language of video games at this point. And these ones tend to have low commercial interest, so there's just very low accessibility for them. There's also the issue that digital game platforms today tend to be volatile. They go down, games get delisted. We actually encountered this during our study. Nintendo shut down some of the storefronts for their old consoles, and the estimate we saw was that about 1,000 games fell out of distribution when that happened, which is a pretty horrible number. That's kind of an apocalypse for video game availability in that case. And actually, it happened. I went back to the results of this study. We wrapped this up, and I think April this year. Of that sample that we said yes on, 3 of those games are now back out of distribution. So this problem is actually getting worse over time, even as games keep getting re-released. So this is where libraries come into the picture. To think about where things are now with video game preservation, right now, library collections for games tend to be what you see private collectors doing. They can get a copy of a game and put it on a shelf. And if a researcher wants to access it, they have to go to the library and play it in person. Which, for preservation needs, if your preservation needs are just keeping something on a shelf, that's fine. But I think about our colleague Bo Ruberg, who had a great quote where they said that preservation and access go hand in hand. They are effectively the same thing. So for accessibility, if you want to play a 100-hour role-playing game and that involves flying out to a museum and arranging lodging and travel so you can sit in a reading room for 100 hours playing this game, we don't think that meets researchers' needs either. And we need to start imagining what libraries can be doing differently to start meeting those needs. So we have a couple things that we've been batting around. The big one is the idea of remote digital access. We have technology now that allows us to provide sort of controlled, remote, secure access to video games through your browser, through emulation technology. But consistently, we've been receiving pushback about things like this from the video game industry, making the argument that, again, there are video games that are getting reissued, right? That there is this market, and if libraries can essentially distribute video games, that's infringing on their market. So there's an active push to amend copyright law to make this easier, which Kendra is going to be talking about in just a few minutes. There's also the idea, which I think James Newman's going to be speaking about a little bit, of maybe we can start documenting video games as an alternative to preserving the games themselves, especially for games that, you can't save a discrete object of. Like, how do you preserve Fortnite? And more libraries are starting to get into the idea of preserving gameplay capture, essentially, as a way of preserving the experience of what it was like to play the game. And I do also want to mention piracy exists. I think most classic games you can get via piracy. It's not a great solution. It's kind of a release valve. We don't want to, it's not something where you're like, yeah, everyone just pirate everything. It's great. But it's not something sustainable. Like, I don't know if that's going to be a sustainable option in 50 to 100 years. So we need to think about how we can empower institutions to fix this problem. And that's what this is all about, is, video game companies are in it to make a profit. There's no incentive for them to keep tens of thousands of old games on the market that aren't going to sell copies. So this isn't necessarily the industry's problem to fix. We want to think about, how can libraries build collections that reach communities? How can libraries go beyond the rare artifact model of game collecting and start finding ways to provide greater access to out-of-print games that complements the efforts of the commercial industry? I'm leaving that question kind of open-ended because our speakers are going to be talking about that in just a second. But thanks so much, and excuse me, I will hand things over to Kendra to take it from there.
Awesome, amazing. Thank you so much, Phil. A hard act to follow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what we've been working on in terms of copyright law, and sort of trying to solve is a strong word, but sort of get rid of some of the harms that law has done to the types of preservation processes and projects that Phil is describing. But I actually wanted to sort of back up a little bit and sort of tell the story of like how I ended up, being on this panel or in conversation like about this stuff, especially with an eye towards not focusing entirely on kind of a set of like legal interventions or kind of that we've been pursuing in the US that may not be lined up with what might be possible in other countries. Like, I don't want to sit here and lecture you on US law for 10 minutes. That's not useful. But I feel like I'm getting a little bit kind of like nostalgic about this sort of even hearing Phil talk about kind of the work that has been done and the work that needs to be done. So I want to sort of talk about that. So as of next summer, I will have been working on legal advocacy around software preservation, specifically video game preservation, for 10 years. So I just came up on 9 years. And I started when I was working on it a little bit during a summer where I was interning at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me when I started working on that problem is like, I sort of was just interested in it because I was someone who played a lot of video games and I thought video games were important. And my boss was like, sure, like, why don't you look into video game preservation for their sort of like weird, obscure regulatory process called the 1201 triennial rulemaking, which I'll come back to, but I won't spend too much time on because like I don't want everybody to fall asleep, since I know, especially for folks tuning in from the UK, it is late. And when I started looking into it, I remember encountering like all of these reports and all of this information that made it clear exactly how dire the problem was. And this was very much pre-Phil's report, but I remember reading a report that was sort of done by Stanford called the Preserving Virtual Worlds report, where what they said, and I went and pulled the language. Actually, I went and tried to pull the language, but the Stanford website for it is down. So the only place you can currently find it is on the Internet Archive. Anyway, we'll just not spend too much time thinking about that. But what that report that I remember reading back in 2013 said, it was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act's prohibition on defeating technological protection measures makes it impossible for a library to create preservation copies of games employing DRM and anti-copying measures. And that was from the final report in 2010. And that was sort of like a eureka. I remember having a eureka moment when I read that and just being like, oh my God, okay, like this is a big deal. This really matters. This isn't some sort of like weird off, like maybe it's an issue, and of course there are, as everyone on this call probably knows already, 1,000 other problems in video game preservation that aren't the law, but the law is a big one, right? And what this report was telling me was that this specific prohibition, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Section 1201, the thing I was working on made it impossible to do preservation. So, maybe the lesson I want to take from that moment that I had was, it was really useful that someone had sat there and written down what everyone already knew. right? And I think this goes to part of what Phil's saying, which is, through a lot of my work on video game preservation, one of the challenges has been that like we were pretty sure that games just didn't get re-released. Like I knew that kind of, I think as Phil said, there was a lot of anecdotes, but it was very difficult to point to sources that actually showed that. And so one of the things that has been incredibly useful to me in sort of the history of my work on this has been, folks from different angles, kind of writing down. I see the chat, and I'll drop a link after I finish talking, just to make sure that I don't totally lose my train of thought. Writing down the things, or even documenting the sort of what's known in the field or what's known in the space. And it also makes me think actually of James's book Best Before, which I remember reading, I think in 2014, where, if I'm remembering correctly, and I didn't go verify this, so James, you'll just have to be kind to me if I'm misremembering. James talks about like the difference between playing games on a CRT monitor versus playing them on sort of as they would have originally been played versus playing them on more recent technology, and how the basically like that meant that the experience of playing the game was entirely different. And so this kind of documentation by academics, this kind of work, was so important to me when I started out in this process, just to not be like kind of just guessing. So that's my like first message about how to do this kind of advocacy, especially if you are sort of more on the kind of preservation institution side than on the lawyer side. Okay, so what advocacy is this? Why am I qualified to talk to you about advocacy? Well, so for those 10 years, I've been participating in a process every 3 years in front of the Library of Congress, where we basically go ask the Library of Congress to let libraries and archives and museums do what they probably should have been able to do anyway, which is break digital rights management that prevents preservation of works. So if you want to copy that floppy, if you want to sort of convert something from, fragile piece of physical media into a disk image that can sort of stand the test of time, and the original owners put some DRM on it, or you need a dongle or a key or whatever. That is the thing that the Preserving Virtual Worlds report was sort of calling out as not feasible. And that's the thing that we've been working on. And we've had a lot of success. I mean, as Phil mentioned, there's still a ways to go. We'd still be very excited about preservation, or about access to preserve video games off-site. Right now, it's only allowed on premises. But over the course of those years, we've actually kind of moved the ball, I think, in a meaningful way towards the work that people want to do, and getting the law out of the way of what is already an incredibly difficult thing. And I think it brings me to sort of another quote that I went back and looked up today, because I remembered, and I thought it was the thing that was in the Preserving Virtual Worlds report. It was not. So you got to be careful about your own shitty memory. That's my takeaway. But I remember a quote that Jerome McDonough, rest in power, gave me when I first started doing this, where he said, digital media is inherently fragile. This was an email he sent me. And the ability to migrate games to new hardware/media is critical to any preservation activity we might take, whether through migration or emulation. The DMCA's technological protection measure language takes the difficult case of software preservation and transforms it into a fundamentally impossible case. And so I see my role kind of as to try to move it back to the difficult case from the fundamentally impossible case. And our advocacy in front of the Copyright Office to try to eliminate some of the restrictions on removing digital rights management for preserving works is part of that. So I think, point two about what's worked well for that is just doing it over time. It's taken a long time to get to where we have now. We go there every 3 years. We ask again. Certain processes might not be as sort of time consuming and accretive as that one is, but I think we can show that we've like actually made real progress, and maybe more notably that the sky hasn't fallen as we sort of allow preservation institutions to provide more access to these video games. I think the third thing I want to sort of emphasize as something I've learned from doing this work, is that it's really important to think about collaboration between researchers, between preservationists, and advocates. So, when Phil talks about this report, part of this came out of the fact that last cycle, when we went in front of the Copyright Office, the video game industry said, we don't actually believe that there's a problem, that we reissue games. And I was just like, I don't understand how to deal with this, right? Like, this is so far from my experience of video games that I honestly feel like it shouldn't pass the laugh test. But for folks outside the field, it may seem actually reasonable to say, hey, yeah, video games are reissued. And so being able to work with Phil, being able to work with the many researchers and Bo Ruberg, including Bo Ruberg, who testified for us in front of the Library of Congress last time, has made it possible for us to sort of, as an advocate, not just say that this is sort of an intellectual issue, but also to show that there are real impacts for the restrictions. And it's really important for this form of cultural heritage for folks to be able to access it. So I'll stop there. Yeah, Phil's point in chat is a good one. I'm happy to talk about any of that more, including the very specifics of the law that I'm talking about. But I figured for this particular audience and setting, it's probably more interesting to talk about sort of what I've learned about the advocacy more generally. And I'll just hand it over to James.
Two difficult acts to follow now. So yeah, I planned on saying one thing, and I'm actually going to say something slightly different. I think actually, just to follow on from those really interesting kind of insights, I think, which chime, I suppose, with some of my experiences and some of my work. So and I'll just in terms of a bit of context, I'll probably sort of back up a little bit as well, just to say, so I've been doing game studies in various different forms for about sort of 20 years or so, I suppose, back in the sort of late 1990s. So this is like a really real problem. The thing I study is disappearing at an alarming rate. And I should also say, I've been playing games for longer than that too. So it's also a real problem for me in that capacity as well, because the things I play are also disappearing. That's how I spend my leisure time when I'm not researching games. So it's a double whammy, really. So, I mean, for me, this report is like hugely important in reminding us just how fragile video games are, the object of our study, the object of our interest. And crucially, unless we do something, unless we take like a proactive stance on this, huge swathes of our cultural heritage are just going to become inaccessible, unplayable. And I was really struck, I think, with one of the bullets in Phil's presentation that it's bad but not surprising. Which, if you are involved in this kind of world, whether as a researcher or as a player, you will see this stuff disappearing in front of you. You will see stores closing down and the games that you were able to play yesterday become immediately inaccessible, which I think is a really important point, thinking about how the sort of trajectory of games moving forwards. I mean, yeah, if you want to tell the story of the late 20th century, early 21st century, video games are absolutely crucial. And if they do continue to disappear at this kind of rate, the next generation of players and the next generation of developers are going to lose access to those vital reference points, understand how we got to where we are today. So to say that I think the findings really kind of resonate with me, and it was really this kind of realization that that got me into working with museums and collections. So I'm not a museum person. Almost everyone in my family is, and I now work in museums as well. I think it was destiny in some way, but it's that problem of writing about, of talking about, of teaching about video games that you can't go out and play easily. And we should say easily, because the elephant in the room is that these games are available very often. There are places, there are vast collections, actually extraordinarily well organized, verified, carefully curated collections of material. And I guess setting aside the issues of the kind of legality there, and to come back to that point about collaboration, that there's such an important kind of bank of knowledge locked up that's clearly evident in putting those big RAR and zip files together of verified ROMs. Which just reminds me what a distributed project game preservation is going to need to be. No one organization is going to be able to solve this. It's a big knotty problem with lots of different use cases. Cross-sector collaboration, that doesn't just mean across museums. That's going to mean private collectors. It may even it's going to be a really tricky international problem. Everyone's going to have a different sort of expertise that they can bring to bear. So I think there's a really important kind of point there about collaboration. I think there's an issue as well about the ease with which one could, if one wanted to, find those games in various different forms and formats. kind of makes the problem seem less urgent. These things are disappearing. The availability, as Phil said, of those, of piracy as being the solution, that's not a long-term solution. It isn't even a short-term solution, but it's certainly not a long-term solution. Anyway, sort of slightly digressing. I guess the really big, like for me, the really big sort of takeaways from the report, I guess, to some extent, it looks bad, but it's going to get worse. The situation is not likely to improve unless we do something about it. And I guess come to maybe one of the ways we've been thinking about what we might do in a second. But I guess just to have that sort of thought about the being in the middle of that shift towards digital distribution, digital storefronts, streaming. We don't even have an object to put on the shelves. We don't even necessarily have the ability to work with a developer, publisher, rights holder who actually wants to work with us and preserve that game, because there might be so many kind of intermediate technologies, platforms, systems for data storage and cloud computing that they don't have access to. They wouldn't be able to say yes and give us access to the game even if they wanted to. So I guess those kind of situations where we don't have that kind of physical object, where we're moving towards this kind of digital distribution, we have to think about completely different models for thinking about how we as museums, for example, deal with this kind of material. And I guess the sort of following on from that really is, I guess what's most sort of worrisome, I suppose, from a game historian's perspective, is that reliance at the moment on commercial re-releasing, which just gives us a kind of selective remembering and forgetting of, and a sort of de facto canon of video games that we can play and study in the future. And if that is led by kind of commercial considerations, we'll miss so much of what was important, what was foundational, and what was just ordinary and everyday and mundane about games. We will continue to celebrate the commercial successes that we all agree should be preserved for all time. So just to link together that a couple of points there. So as a person who grew up playing games in the UK, I was quite well versed in playing games that ran quite a lot slower than they did elsewhere in the world. So there's a particular feature of European and other parts of the country television systems which are too technical to go into here, and I'll probably get it wrong anyway. But basically what it means is the games play about 17.5% slower and the graphics are all squashed and letterboxed. And those are the versions that I grew up with, like many tens of thousands, millions of other people. They're versions that get kind of forgotten. Because as these games get re-released on new systems, digital stores, it tends to be the original version, the US Japanese version running at full speed. And there's a big debate as to whether, what is the original version? The slow version was the original version for me. Sonic runs 17.5% slower in the UK than in Japan. But that was my experience. I didn't know any different. This was a world of magazines, and even if I had known any different, the only official version of that game was the one I could buy in the store. So the PAL European experience playing that game is already one which has kind of disappeared, and that's Sonic the Hedgehog. That's a big mainstream title. This isn't something at the kind of margins or fringes in any way, shape, or form. So I guess one of the things that this has sort of led me to, just by way of sort of wrapping up, is that notion of documentation and actually thinking about the limitations of play. So for a long time, I sort of spent, sort of scratching my head thinking, well, these games are disciplined. What can we do? And doing that usual thing about, someone really ought to do something. And then actually starting to think about how much do I actually learn from playing a game? So how much of what I've ended up writing about, researching, finding out about has actually come from my direct playing of a game? So sometimes that could be quite a bit, but very often, actually, my ability to play is the thing that limits my ability to understand what the game is, which is not in any way a humble brag at all. It's just games are hard and they require you to play them multiple times, maybe, to reveal what they do. They often hide what's interesting about them. They might only reveal what's interesting about them in some glitchy circumstance that very rarely happens. They might require loads of a priori knowledge. They might require lots of players playing together, collaborating to create the thing that becomes really interesting about them. There's so many different ways of playing a game, so many glitches. I'm mildly obsessed with 0% speed runs at the moment, which just completely transform games that I feel I have an understanding of, when a game that I think takes 100 hours to complete is completed in 2.5 minutes. So this is a complete, transformation of what this thing is, and that I suppose led me to thinking that documentation might be a really useful, not in any way a sort of competing, but a complementary way of thinking about what we're actually trying to do here. So if I thought about what I might want as a researcher in the future, actually what I really want to hear from is the players that play these games, talking about them, talking about how they made them, talking about how they played them, talking about how they found out those techniques and shared them. So actually something that could involve gameplay capture, but could just as easily involve oral histories. So I guess that was part of what I've been thinking recently, is that the fragility of games, the fact that they are disappearing, actually causes me almost to think of playability as a moment in the life of a game. And that's actually really, I found that really liberating, because actually it sort of focuses me on then thinking, okay, well, we need to document these things now. We need to start thinking about them. And it reminds me that preservation is a problem, is a live, active, issue in the moment. It's not a thing that only looks back. I have no idea how long I've been talking for, but I could talk for another 3 or 4 hours, so I should probably stop. So I hope that was a useful contribution in some way.
It was incredibly useful, yeah. We have time for you to go for a few more minutes if you
Be careful.
You wanted to.
Well, I guess I was just, there's one particular example actually. It was a project I did with the museum, National Video Game Museum, recently. So over lockdown, it became very clear that Animal Crossing had a very particular and special role that it was playing, perhaps quite unexpected, unanticipated. And we initiated a project where we wanted to kind of capture some of the meanings that Animal Crossing was having for its players. So we didn't do any kind of didn't do any sort of traditional game preservation, no digital preservation. We don't have a version of the game that's playable, but we put an open call out for people to. The project was called the Animal Crossing Diaries, to, in whatever form or format they wanted to respond, to talk about their experiences of Animal Crossing during that period where movement, meeting up with friends, routine were all disrupted in pretty severe ways. And it turns out that this game that's about meeting up with your friends and routine turned out to have an extraordinarily important role. People were managing their mental health. They were running clubs. They transformed in the same way that Zoom, which was once a remote. It was for teams of remote workers to stay in touch in business context, and soon turned into something where people were having pub quizzes and Sunday lunches together. Animal Crossing became such an unexpectedly creative social space. People talked about this place. They were going there. They were maintaining their relationships, meeting up with the animals as well. And that project then, as really much more of an oral history project, I think really sort of revealed the people that actually make these games what they are. Games was much about practices and play. So I guess that was as an example of something that we were kind of thinking of, and putting that sort of gameplay preservation notion, which was a kind of thought experiment in that book that Kendra mentioned, putting that into practice which is one of the really neat things with working with a museum, is to take some of those thought experiments and see if they actually see if we can actually turn them into strategies. And now I will be quiet.